What if everything you learned about the beginning of human civilization is actually just the most recent chapter? Not the first one, not even close to the first one. What if the story of organized, intelligent, technologically capable human society has been written and erased, again and again, long before anyone built the first pyramid or pressed the first cuneiform symbol into wet clay? Here's the question that's going to drive everything we do today. What if we are not the first great civilization on this planet, but the seventh? Now, before your brain goes straight to pyramids built by aliens' territory, stay with me, because this isn't about ancient astronauts or hollow earth theories. This is about something far more unsettling: the actual gaps in the archaeological record, the traditions that show up independently across cultures that had no contact with each other, the structures we can't fully explain, the flood myths that appear on 6 continents, the star maps that shouldn't exist. The question isn't whether ancient people were magical. The question is whether we're arrogant enough to assume that complex, organized, knowledge-accumulating human societies could only have emerged once in our timeline, starting around 5,000 years ago. Let's define our terms, because this matters enormously. When we say advanced civilization, we don't necessarily mean smartphones and nuclear reactors. We mean something more fundamental. We mean societies with organized astronomy, capable of tracking celestial cycles across generations, engineering sophisticated enough to reshape landscapes, build structures aligned with precision, and move enormous amounts of material. Systems of knowledge transfer, whether that's writing, oral tradition, or symbolic recording. Evidence of long-distance trade and coordination between groups separated by geography. Social organization complex enough to sustain specialization, meaning people whose entire job was to think, design, or remember rather than just survive. By that definition, civilizations don't require electricity. They require intention, and that raises the uncomfortable possibility that intention has existed in our species far longer than our textbooks currently acknowledge. Here's how this is going to work. We're not going to promise you certainty. That's not what this is. What we're going to do is investigate 6 specific claims, 6 alleged predecessor civilizations that historians, archaeologists, mythologists, and yes, some fringe theorists point to as evidence that something came before us. And for each one, we're going to sort evidence from interpretation and interpretation from legend. Because those 3 things are not the same, and treating them as if they are is how you end up either blindly dismissing everything or blindly believing everything, and neither of those positions is honest. Some of what we're going to look at will genuinely surprise you, not because it proves ancient advanced civilizations, but because the actual peer-reviewed evidence is stranger and more unresolved than mainstream summaries suggest. And some of what we look at will turn out to be a fascinating lesson in how human beings construct myths to explain the world they don't understand. Both of those outcomes are worth your time. Quick thing before we go any further. If you're listening to this on Spotify, follow the channel there. It's ad-free, it's music-free, and following on Spotify is genuinely one of the best ways to support this work. The link is in the description. If you're watching this on YouTube, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are and what time it is. Seriously, do it. Because every time I check comments, it turns out to be London at 2 a.m. and Chicago over lunch, and someone in the Philippines at sunrise, all watching the same thing at the same moment. It's one of the strangest and most remarkable things about what we do here, and I never get tired of it. Now, 6 alleged predecessors, each one rooted in something real. Whether that's an ancient text, an anomalous structure, a mythological tradition, or a geological event. We're going to look at the flood narratives buried in Mesopotamian and biblical records, the Egyptian concept of a golden age before recorded history, Plato's Atlantis, and what he actually wrote versus what people claim he wrote, the vast cycles of time in Indian tradition, and the cities that may have sunk beneath the Indian Ocean, Mesoamerican records of worlds that came before this one, and the most scientifically grounded hypothesis of them all, the idea that an Ice Age culture was effectively reset by a catastrophe 12,000 years ago. 6 civilizations, 6 sets of records, 6 reasons people believe we've been here before. Let's find out what's actually there. Before we dive into any of these specific claims, we need to build something. A toolkit. Because the single biggest mistake people make when investigating lost civilization theories isn't being too skeptical or too credulous. It's approaching the question without any framework at all, just vibes and YouTube thumbnails, and a vague sense that ancient people were either idiots who somehow built impossible things, or geniuses who left no other trace of their genius. Neither of those positions survives contact with actual evidence. So let's talk about how to think about this before we talk about what to think. The basic toolkit has 4 components: primary sources, which means the actual original texts, inscriptions, and records, not someone's summary of someone else's interpretation of a translation; archaeology, which means physical evidence pulled from the ground with documented context; geology, which gives us a timeline for what the planet was actually doing at any given moment; and comparative mythology, which is the careful, systematic study of how stories spread, mutate, and preserve cultural memory across time. Each of these disciplines has limitations. None of them alone gives you the full picture. But together, they form something that's genuinely powerful, a way of triangulating between what people said, what they built, what the earth recorded, and what stories survived. Here's where it gets immediately complicated. Almost every lost civilization claim eventually involves what someone calls secret records, hidden archives, ancient texts preserved by esoteric orders, manuscripts that mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge. And look, the instinct to believe in suppressed knowledge is deeply human. Power does suppress information. Colonial empires burned libraries. Religious institutions destroyed texts. Archives do get restricted. All of that is real, but it's worth understanding how secret records typically arise, because the pattern is almost always the same. It starts with something genuine, a restricted archive, a partially translated text, a real oral tradition that outsiders weren't allowed to access. Then that kernel gets picked up and amplified, usually through a chain of retellings that adds a little more drama at each step. By the time it reaches a 19th century occultist or a 20th century paperback or a 21st century Reddit thread, the original grain of truth has been buried under layers of embellishment, misquotation, and wishful thinking. The Vatican archives are real, and some documents there are restricted. That doesn't mean they contain blueprints for Atlantean technology. The difference between those two things is enormous, and it matters. Which brings us to one of the most important distinctions in this entire conversation. The difference between legend as cultural memory and legend as literal history. These are not the same thing, and confusing them is how otherwise smart people end up in trouble. When a legend says a great flood destroyed the world, that doesn't mean either A, a global civilization was literally drowned, or B, the story is pure invention with no connection to reality. What it might mean is that the people who told this story had ancestral memory of a real catastrophic flood, localized but devastating enough to feel like the end of the world, preserved across generations in narrative form, because narrative is how pre-literate societies maintain information. Legends encode real experience. They just encode it through the distorting lens of metaphor, cultural values, and centuries of retelling. The skill is in reading the encoding, not in either taking the literal surface or dismissing the whole thing. Now let's talk about the traps, because there are several, and they're all waiting for you. Confirmation bias is the big one. It works like this. You've already decided that a lost advanced civilization existed. Now every piece of ambiguous evidence becomes confirmation. A rock formation looks vaguely like a wall. Confirmation. A flood myth in a culture you hadn't heard of. Confirmation. An ancient text that might, if translated a certain way, refer to flying machines. Massive confirmation. The problem isn't that you're looking for evidence. The problem is that you've stopped being able to see disconfirming evidence. You need to actively ask yourself, what would convince me I was wrong? And if you can't answer that, you're not investigating anymore. You're just collecting. Anachronism is the second trap. This is when you take a modern concept and project it backwards onto ancient material. When ancient Egyptians described the sun's movement in terms that sound like they understood the solar system, that's fascinating. But it doesn't necessarily mean they had telescopes. It might mean they were extraordinarily careful observers who developed sophisticated conceptual models with naked eye observation alone, which is actually just as impressive. Assuming that precision requires modern technology underestimates ancient people in a completely different direction than calling them aliens did. Misquotation is endemic in this space. Plato did write about Atlantis. He wrote far less than most people think, and what he wrote was far more ambiguous than most people claim. Ancient Vedic texts do describe vehicles that fly. They also describe those vehicles doing things that are physically impossible even by our standards, which should complicate any literal reading. Sumerian king lists do record reigns of impossibly long duration. What you do with those facts depends entirely on whether you've read the original sources or whether you're working from a chain of retellings that has been quietly editorialized at every step. Circular sourcing is the end product of this process, where a claim gets cited back to another source that cites back to the original claim, creating the appearance of corroboration where there is only repetition. So, what would strong evidence actually look like? This is the important question, and most people skip it entirely. Strong evidence for a prehistorical civilization would start with datable physical artifacts. Objects made by intelligent design found in a stratigraphic context, in a layer of Earth that clearly predates the civilizations we already know about. Stratigraphy is geology's gift to archaeology. The layers of soil and rock are a timeline. Find a worked stone tool or a smelted metal object in a layer that's 40,000 years old, and you have something that demands explanation. Find it in a disturbed context, sitting on the surface or in a layer that's been disrupted by erosion or previous excavation, and you have very little. The context is almost more important than the object itself. Inscriptions that can be independently translated, not just interpreted by a single researcher with a theory to support, would constitute strong evidence. Consistent, independent accounts from cultures that demonstrably had no contact with each other, describing specific historical events rather than universal metaphors, would constitute strong evidence. Multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing to the same place and time. That's when a hypothesis stops being a hypothesis and starts being a discovery. Which brings us to mainstream archaeology and why it is the way it is. There's a version of this conversation where mainstream archaeology is a cabal of gatekeepers suppressing revolutionary discoveries to protect their careers. And I understand the appeal of that narrative. It has villains and heroes and forbidden knowledge. But here's the more accurate and honestly more interesting version. Archaeology is cautious because archaeology has been burned repeatedly by sensational claims that didn't hold up. Every decade or so, a major discovery gets announced, the press runs wild with it, and then the scientific process works it over and either confirms, complicates, or quietly deflates it. Scientists are human. They have biases. They protect theories they've spent careers building. That's real. But the self-correcting mechanism of peer review, replication, and independent verification is also real, and it's the best system we've developed for getting closer to truth over time. What would it take to change the consensus? Not a single anomalous artifact. Anomalies appear all the time, and they mostly turn out to have mundane explanations once you look closely. It would take a body of evidence, a site that could be systematically excavated and documented, producing multiple converging lines of data that pointed toward organized intelligent activity at a time before known civilization. It would take independent confirmation from multiple research teams. It would take engagement with the disconfirming evidence, not just a collection of things that fit the theory. The fact that that bar hasn't been cleared yet doesn't mean it never will be. The map of what we know is genuinely incomplete. New sites get discovered every year. Dating technologies keep improving, and the history of archaeology is littered with moments where something everyone thought was settled turned out to be more complicated than anyone expected. That's not an invitation to believe everything. It's an invitation to stay genuinely curious, genuinely rigorous, and genuinely honest about the difference between what we know, what we suspect, and what we're hoping for. Because here's the thing, if there really were civilizations before ours, the way to find them isn't through wishful reading of ambiguous texts. It's through the patient, frustrating, extraordinary work of going and actually looking, with good tools and clear eyes. Let's go look when people say, if there was an advanced civilization before us, where are the ruins? They're bumping into something most of us never think about, deep time. Not a few centuries, not even a few thousand years, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. Our brains are not built for that scale. We imagine time like a long version of our own history. Castles crumble a bit, but they're still there. Old roads crack, but you can still see them from the sky. We project that out and assume that if something big ever existed, it would still be sticking out of the ground somewhere, waiting for a drone shot. The planet does not work like that. Start with the most obvious place to build a civilization, the coast. That's where we build now. Food-rich estuaries, gentle climates, easy transport by water. If you're going to get trade, surplus, and specialization, three things every civilization needs, coasts and river deltas, are the natural choice. They're also some of the least stable landscapes on Earth. Sea level hasn't been constant. During the last ice age, when enormous ice sheets locked up water at the poles, global sea level was about 120 meters lower than today. That's a skyscraper's height of ocean that has been poured back onto the coasts in the last 20,000 years. Whole continental shelves that were dry land when mammoths were wandering around are now underwater plains. If humans, or anyone else, built long-lived settlements there, those settlements are now on the sea floor. River deltas are even more volatile. They build outwards as rivers dump sediment, then abruptly shift when channels change course, when floods carve new paths, when storms rearrange everything. Ancient delta cities, even from known historical periods, can end up buried under tens of meters of mud, or eroded away and carried out to sea grain by grain. The Nile, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus, all of them have moved and reorganized themselves over time. You can see this even in the last few thousand years. Stretch that process back hundreds of thousands, and almost nothing original survives at the surface. And all of that is happening on top of a crust that is literally moving. Plate tectonics means continents aren't fixed backdrops. They collide, they rift, they crumple and erode. Mountain ranges that were once sea floors get pushed up, folded, and then shaved down by ice and rain. Oceanic crust, where a lot of those submerged continental shelves end, is gradually dragged back into the mantle at subduction zones and recycled. Give the Earth enough time, and it doesn't just demolish buildings, it erases whole landscapes. So if you ask, where are the skyscrapers from a civilization 5 million years ago? The most honest answer is almost certainly ground to mineral dust, subducted or lying in fragments under hundreds of meters of sediment or water. Not because of a conspiracy, because of geology. Now add another layer, preservation bias. Archaeologists use this term to describe the fact that what we find is not a neutral sample of what once existed. Some things have a much better chance of surviving than others. Stone tools, ceramics, fired clay. They're tough. They can sit in the ground for 100,000 years and come out chipped, but recognizable. Bone can survive under the right conditions, but wood, textiles, leather, most metals, they're temporary on deep timescales. Iron rusts, copper corrodes, aluminum oxidizes into crusts that look like natural minerals. Electronics, our most obvious signatures of complexity, are made of plastic, glass and metals that break down, leach out, and physically disintegrate when exposed to water, microbes and chemistry over long spans. Put your phone in a landfill and come back in 10,000 years. You won't find a phone. You'll find a chemically altered smear. This is why the oldest human artifacts we have are overwhelmingly stone. It's not because ancient people only had stone. It's because stone is what survives. Every spear point in a museum probably sat next to wooden shafts, sinew bindings, leather clothing, woven baskets, wooden structures, and maybe even simple metal ornaments that rotted and vanished completely. The archaeological record is the leftover segment of a much bigger cultural iceberg, and the further back you go, the smaller the visible tip. Underwater archaeology complicates this in both directions. On the one hand, the sea can be a great preserver. Deep, cold, low-oxygen environments slow decay dramatically. Shipwrecks like the Antikythera wreck or ancient canoes survive because they got buried fast in protective sediments. On the other hand, access is brutally hard. Most of the now submerged coastal plains are at depths that require specialized equipment, expensive expeditions, and very targeted searching. We have mapped the broad shape of a lot of the seafloor, but we have not combed it at archaeological resolution. So when someone says, "What about all those submerged landscapes from the last ice age? Could they hide something big?" The honest answer is yes, they could hide coastal settlements, harbours, maybe even pretty complex trading communities that never show up on terrestrial surveys. What they can't do is magically conceal a global technological civilization that spanned continents, launched satellites, and mined at industrial scales. That kind of activity leaves not just buildings but planetary signatures, altered isotope ratios from large-scale industry, weird spikes in certain pollutants, massive landscape modification. People actually look for these things not just for humans, but as part of the Silurian hypothesis, the question of whether a previous industrial species would leave a detectable geologic fingerprint. So far, nothing. Catastrophes complicate the picture in another way. Different ways of collapsing leave different fingerprints in the ground. A sudden catastrophe, a mega tsunami, supervolcano, asteroid impact, rapid sea level jump tends to create clear, sharp layers. You get a band of debris or ash, abrupt break in occupation, sometimes bodies in situ. You see this in the archaeological record of real disasters. Cities buried under volcanic ash, coastal settlements with tsunami deposits full of marine sand and broken pottery, abrupt abandonment horizons. Slow decline looks different. Populations thin out, building quality drops, long-distance trade shrinks, trash deposits change character. Over centuries, stone buildings get robbed for later construction, wooden structures rot, fields revert to scrub and forest. A city can turn into a faint scatter of pottery, brick dust, and pollen changes in the soil. Give that process not 500 years, but 50,000. And erosion smooths the whole story into a couple of centimetres of mixed sediment. So when we don't find abrupt, dramatic end-of-the-world layers corresponding to some claimed lost civilization date, that's meaningful evidence against asteroid-scale resets. But it doesn't tell us much about whether smaller, regional, or slower declines happened in places we haven't dug, or in landscapes that have since been reworked beyond recognition. This is where people often make a logical leap. We haven't found X, therefore X never existed. Or, on the flip side, we haven't found X, therefore X might be anything I want it to be. Both positions ignore the realities of deep time and preservation. Absence of evidence is not automatically evidence of absence. It depends on what kind of evidence you're talking about, how easy it would be to preserve, how likely we'd be to have looked in the right places, and what else the planet was doing in the meantime. A small, coastal, Bronze Age-level culture living 20,000 years ago is much easier to lose than a global, industrial, 21st century-level civilization living 2 million years ago. One could plausibly be mostly underwater and under sediment. The other should have left chemical scars in the atmosphere, weird sediment layers, mines stripped of accessible ore. We haven't seen those, so we're left in attention. The Earth is fully capable of erasing most traces of many kinds of human societies over long stretches of time. That's a real physical fact. At the same time, the more complex, technological, and truly global a civilization is, the harder it becomes to hide it completely. That's another fact. Our task, if we're going to talk seriously about 6 civilizations before ours, is to live inside that tension. We have to respect the plausible disappearance mechanisms, erosion, tectonics, sea level rise, preservation bias without using them as a blank check to imagine anything we like. And we have to insist that even in deep time, civilizations leave some kind of concrete, datable trace if they reach a certain scale. So as we turn now to those ancient stories, Mesopotamian flood tales, Egypt's first time, Plato's drowning island, India's yugas, the question shifts. Not could a civilization vanish, because in many forms, yes, it could. The question is, what level of civilization are these traditions really pointing to? And do we see even the faintest physical echoes in the places and times they seem to describe? To get to our alleged first lost civilization, we have to start in a very particular place, the floodplain of the Tigris and Euphrates, about 5,000 years ago, with a weird little document called the Sumerian King List. On the surface it sounds simple. It's a list of kings, where they ruled and how long they reigned. But immediately something feels off. The earliest rulers on the list are said to have reigned for 28,000 years. 36,000 years. A single king ruling longer than our entire written history. Alternative history writers grab this with both hands. Look, they say, this is evidence of a pre-flood civilization. The Sumerians remembered rulers from tens of thousands of years before their time. Maybe these weren't just kings. Maybe they were technocrats, scientists, even non-human beings with lifespans and knowledge far beyond ours. Mainstream scholars read the same text and see something different. Not a census, but a statement. The king list, in their view, is political theology. It's trying to say legitimate kingship is a divine institution, passed from city to city under the guidance of the gods. The huge reign lengths in the antediluvian section aren't meant to be read like a spreadsheet. They're symbolic. They mark a mythic era when humans and gods weren't clearly separated, when time itself was different. Then everything changes with one line. Then the flood swept over. After that, reign lengths snapped down from tens of thousands of years to lengths we'd recognize as human. A few decades, a century or two at most, kingship, the text says, was lowered from heaven again, but now in a post-flood world that looks more like history. So we have this pattern. Impossibly long-lived rulers before a great flood. Normal kings afterward. Mesopotamian tablets are not the only place we see it. In the Hebrew Bible you get the same rhythm. The patriarchs before the flood, Adam, Methuselah, Noah, live for centuries. After the waters recede, lifespans shorten in stages until they land somewhere near our own. Is that evidence for a superhuman antediluvian race? You can read it that way, but you don't have to. Another possibility is that cultures, when they look back into their own deep past, compress and blur time, Generations of tribal leaders, elders, or clan founders can collapse into a single legendary ancestor. Stories that originally described whole lineages get retold as the life of one long-lived hero. Add in a worldview where age equals wisdom equals authority, and exaggerated lifespans become a narrative tool. Our tradition is old. Our founders were close to the beginning. Therefore their way is legitimate. The flood itself is where the story really bites people's imagination, because it's not just one text. In the Atlantis epic, the gods send a flood to wipe out noisy, overpopulous humans. One man, Atlantis, is warned to build a boat, load it with animals, and ride out the catastrophe. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood survivor is Utnapishtim, telling a very similar story to a king who wants the secret of immortality. In the Bible, it's Noah, building an ark at divine instruction and repopulating the world afterward. Details shift: boat size, number of days of rain, which God sends the warning, but the skeleton is the same. A world before, a warning, a chosen survivor, a great flood, a restart. For people who like the 6 civilizations before us idea, this looks like a smoking gun. Multiple cultures in the same region, all talking about a catastrophic flood and a destroyed earlier age. Maybe, they say, those antediluvian kings represent an advanced culture that was wiped out. Maybe the Ark is a garbled memory of a group preserving advanced knowledge, technologies, even seed banks or devices. This is where the Watchers and the Nephilim enter the picture. In the Book of Enoch and other Second Temple Jewish texts, the sons of God in Genesis become the Watchers, heavenly beings who descend, take human wives, and teach forbidden knowledge, metalworking, cosmetics, enchantments, astronomy. Their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, are described as giants, men of renown, violent and corrupt. God sends the flood in part to scrub this tainted mixture from the world. Later readers, especially in occult and alternative archaeology circles, reframe this as a story about advanced beings seeding civilization. The Watchers become extraterrestrials or members of a prior high-tech culture. The forbidden knowledge becomes advanced metallurgy, medicine, maybe even energy systems. The Nephilim are cast as genetically modified elites or failed experiments swept away in a global reset. It's an intoxicating narrative. It connects long-lived antediluvian kings, a deliberate transfer of knowledge, a catastrophic flood, and a sense that there was once a version 1.0 of civilization that went horribly wrong. But if we take a step back and ask, what is the minimum historical core we actually need here? The picture gets more modest and frankly more interesting. The southern Mesopotamian plain is practically designed for flood legends. Low, flat land, rivers that meander, merge, and occasionally go rogue. Seasonal rains upstream, snowmelt in the highlands. When the Tigris or Euphrates overtop their banks, they don't just make puddles. They can spread out over huge areas, turning settlements into islands, islands into lakes, lakes into brown, churning seas. Now imagine a regional flood on the scale of, say, the 1931 China floods, or the periodic, devastating inundations the Nile used to bring when it misbehaved. For the people living there, their whole world would be underwater. Villages gone, fields erased, livestock drowned, boats and rafts carrying the lucky few who got a warning in time. A generation later, that's no longer the time that River X flooded. It's the time the whole world drowned. Take that memory, retell it for 500 years, and plug it into a worldview where the gods punish and reset humanity, and you get Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Noah. Notice how grounded a historical core could be. We don't need a planet-spanning ocean covering every mountain. We need one or several very bad regional floods in a corridor that later produced the first large-scale urban societies and wrote down their origin stories. We add in memory compression, where separate floods, famines, and invasions get merged into one archetypal catastrophe. We end up with a mythic flood that still carries the imprint of real water on real bricks. So what would count as actual corroboration that these flood stories are preserving a deep civilizational break, not just a bad season? Archaeologically, we'd look for flood deposits, distinct layers of riverborne silt or sand, laid down over broad areas that can be securely dated and matched across sites. We'd look for settlement breaks, generations where cities and towns are suddenly abandoned, populations plummet, material culture shifts. We'd look for continuity patterns, evidence that some knowledge, styles, or practices survive the break and reappear afterward, suggesting people really did carry something through the disaster. In southern Mesopotamia, we do find flood layers at some sites, though they don't all line up neatly into one single Noah event. We see urban collapses and reconfiguration. We see older villages washed out and new towns founded a bit higher up. So there is some geological and archaeological backing for the idea that big disruptive floods shaped Mesopotamian memory. What we don't see is any trace of pre-Sumerian skyscraper cities, industrial mining, global trade routes, or the kind of technological infrastructure that would qualify as a prior high-tech civilization. No anomalous metal alloys in deep layers, no synthetic compounds that don't match known Bronze Age chemistry, no fossil fuel signatures baked into the sediments. That doesn't make the myths meaningless. It just means we need to read them for what they're good at. Flood stories, antediluvian king lists, watchers and Nephilim. They're telling us that ancient people were obsessed with beginnings and endings. They felt themselves living after something. After a purer age, after a disaster, after a time when gods and heroes walked more closely with humans. They sensed, correctly, that civilizations can rise, distort, and fall. They encoded that intuition into stories about impossibly long-lived kings and cosmic resets. Those stories might be echoing real regional collapses that wiped out earlier, simpler societies, farmers, proto-towns, maybe even modest city-states whose bricks have long since melted back into the floodplain. They might even be preserving, in mythic form, the idea that knowledge can leap across a break, that survivors can carry techniques, rituals, and stories from a drowned world into a new one. But myth, by itself, is not a radiocarbon date. It doesn't automatically equal particle beams, airships, or lost satellites. To argue for a truly advanced antediluvian civilization, we'd need the same things we look for in our own deep time: datable layers, clear material culture, technological signatures. In Mesopotamia and the biblical traditions, what we actually see is powerful memory of water and loss, wrapped around the birth of the first cities we can document. The antediluvian world, there is less likely a skyscraper age before ours, and more likely a blurred sacred prehistory of real farmers and real floods whose specifics have washed away, leaving only the archetype. If older, more advanced worlds did exist, we'll need more than long-reign lists and giant hybrids to find them. Which brings us to another civilization that claimed to remember a first time before history, carved right into the stone of its temples. In Egypt, that first time has a name: Zep Tepi. If you could walk into a temple in ancient Heliopolis and ask the priests, when did it all begin? They wouldn't say 4000 BC or year one of King so-and-so. They'd point you back to Zep Tepi, the first occasion, the time when the world emerged from chaos, when the gods themselves first ruled on earth. In their stories, it's not kings and pharaohs at the start. It's Atum or Ra, standing on the first mound of dry land that rose out of the primeval waters. It's Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, Osiris and Isis, a chain of divine generations ruling Egypt long before any human dynasty. For people who like the 6 civilizations before us idea, this sounds very familiar. Mesopotamia has antediluvian kings. The Bible has patriarchs before the flood. Egypt has Zep-Tepi, an age of god-kings before history. You can see why lost civilization narratives love it. In their retellings, Zep-Tepi becomes not just a mythic dawn, but a literal earlier cycle of high technology. The gods become either survivors of a prior advanced civilization or outright extraterrestrials. Their first time is recast as an era of precision engineering, energy devices, levitation tools, all later misunderstood as magic by the Egyptians. Then there's a piece of real crumbly papyrus that seems to add fuel, the Turin King List. It's a New Kingdom document, written maybe 1,200 years after the Great Pyramid, that tries to list every ruler of Egypt. The version we have is a jigsaw puzzle, hundreds of fragments, but enough survives to be intriguing. It doesn't just list the historical pharaohs we know from monuments. It also includes long sequences of beings described as gods, followers of Horus, and other semi-divine rulers, stretching back thousands of years before the first dynastic king, Narmer. Some fragments give reign lengths that sound ambitious. Thousands of years for divine beings, hundreds for the followers of Horus. The structure echoes the Sumerian king list so closely that it feels like déjà vu, a mythic pre-human rulership, then a handoff to recognizably human kings. Alternative writers point to this and say, there it is. Egypt remembers an entire pre-dynastic civilization. The gods and followers of Horus were the keepers of lost technology. When their world collapsed, the early pharaohs inherited scraps of their knowledge. Mainstream Egyptologists read the same fragments and see, again, theology. The list is saying, our kingship is not random. It descends from the gods in a continuous chain. It's a cosmic pedigree, not a census. The vast reign lengths function as in Mesopotamia, markers of a qualitatively different sacred time. So, as with the Sumerian king list, we have to ask, what's the minimum amount of real history this might be wrapping? We know from archaeology that Egypt didn't pop into existence with stone pyramids already in place. There's a deep pre-dynastic record. Badarian farmers, Nakada cultures, small chiefdoms along the Nile, villages that slowly grow in complexity from about 5000 BC onward. Pottery styles change, burial customs evolve, we see local elites accumulating power, building bigger tombs, controlling trade. By around 3100 BC, those separate chiefdoms knit into a unified state. Writing appears, monumental tombs and temples start to rise. This is the early dynastic period. It's impressive, but it's not a discontinuous jump from nothing. You can trace the gradual build-up in material culture layer by layer. Egyptology as a field is comfortable with a long runway before the pharaohs. It accepts centuries of pre-dynastic development, regional elites, symbolic kingship, probably lots of semi-legendary local rulers whose names we'll never know. It doesn't accept because it doesn't see evidence for a prior cycle of skyscraper-level technology that vanished without a trace and then restarted with mud brick villages. So where does the sense of something too advanced come from? Put simply, Giza. Stand in front of the Great Pyramid, run your hand along the surviving casing stones, and it's hard not to feel like you're looking at something that shouldn't exist in the Bronze Age. The base is nearly perfectly level within a few centimetres. The sides are aligned to true north with astonishing precision. The joints between casing blocks are so tight that in many places you can't slide a blade between them. Add in the shear scale over 2 million blocks, some weighing tens of tons, and the complex internal passages, and your brain starts looking for shortcuts. They must have had some lost technology. Lasers, power tools, anti-gravity. Something. Engineering explanations, though, don't require any of that. Given enough labour time and obsessive surveying, you can get extraordinary precision with Bronze Age tools. Copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sledges, levers, rollers, and a lot of organized manpower go a long way. Experiments have shown you can move multi-ton blocks on sledges over sand if you wet the ground. A small team with plumb bobs, sighting rods, and cord grids can achieve alignments modern people assume require GPS. That doesn't mean we have every detail nailed down. Egyptologists and engineers still argue about the exact ramp configurations used, whether spiral ramps wrapped the pyramid, whether internal ramps were carved as they went, how precisely crews coordinated the final casing. But those were arguments within a Bronze Age toolbox. They're about logistics, not lasers. The same pattern appears in another controversial piece of Giza, the Sphinx. Mainstream view. The Sphinx was carved around 2500 BC during the reign of Khafra, the builder of the second pyramid. The style matches. The alignment fits the Giza plan. There are causeways and temples that line up with his complex. Weathering is mostly explained by wind erosion, salt exfoliation, and later flooding of the enclosure when the water table rose. Alternative view. The Sphinx is much older. Some geologists argue that the heavy vertical erosion on the body and enclosure walls looks more like rainwater runoff over long periods than mere wind and sand. Since the Giza Plateau has been a desert for most of the past several thousand years, they suggest the core of the Sphinx must date back to a wetter climate, maybe 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. In that telling, the Sphinx becomes a survivor from a pre-dynastic, perhaps pre-Holocene civilization, later recarved and reused by the Old Kingdom pharaohs. This water erosion hypothesis is hotly contested. Other geologists point out that limestone can weather unevenly due to differences in composition, that groundwater and salt can produce similar patterns, and that the evidence for heavy rainfall at the necessary dates in that specific spot is thin. No consensus has formed that forces a radical redating. So we're in a familiar situation, an anomaly that could be read as hinting at deeper time, but that also has plausible explanations within the accepted chronology. It's an open technical debate, not a smoking gun for a vanished advanced age. The deeper question, if we're asking, are we the seventh civilization, is how to separate legitimate awe at Egyptian achievements from the leap to unknown technology. A good rule of thumb is this: if you can, even in principle, explain something with known materials, tools, and methods, scaled up to thousands of workers and decades of effort, you don't need to invoke a hidden tech base. Precise stone cutting. We have experimental archaeology showing how to do it with copper saws, sand abrasives, and time. Astronomical alignments. Priests with generations of sky watching and sighting rods can lock onto cardinal directions remarkably well. Where questions remain, exact ramp systems, the fine-grained chronology of specific monuments, the full symbolic program behind Giza's layout. They're interesting engineering and cultural puzzles. They are not, by default, proof of gravity beams or alien drills. Zep Tepi and the divine rulers of the Turin King list probably do preserve something real, but on a different scale. They encode the memory that before unified kings there were older, fuzzier forms of authority, sacred ancestors, legendary chieftains, local gods, whose shrines predated the state. They project that hazy prehistory backward into a perfect first time when order emerged from chaos. It might be that scattered, pre-dynastic elites built impressive shrines or proto-monuments we haven't yet found, or that have been recycled into later structures. It might be that real floods, famines, and power struggles got mythologized as the battles of gods at the beginning of the world. But if a full-blown, high-tech Egyptian civilization existed tens of thousands of years before the pyramids, it left no clear, datable, unambiguous material trace beneath or around the monuments we can study. So Egypt gives us the same tension as Mesopotamia: powerful myths of a before time, real but gradual archaeological development, spectacular engineering that pushes human limits without breaking known physics, and a handful of puzzles that keep the door open just enough for speculation. If there were truly older cycles of civilization, they are not shouting from the Giza Plateau. At most, they are whispering through ambiguities in stone and story. To listen harder, we have to leave the Nile and turn to another culture whose most famous lost city exists only in a philosopher's tale. In Greece, the before time doesn't come from temple walls or king lists. It comes from one guy, Plato. Every version of Atlantis you've ever seen, crystal pyramids, energy beams, psychic dolphins, ultimately traces back to two dialogues he wrote in the 4th century BC, Timaeus and Critias. And they don't read like a myth book. They start like a dinner party. In Timaeus, Plato has Socrates hanging out with a small group of intellectuals. One of them, Critias, says basically, "You know that perfect city you described yesterday, Socrates? The ideal republic? Let me tell you a true story from very ancient times that matches it in some ways and shows what happens when such a city goes bad." He says he heard it from his grandfather, also named Critias, who heard it from his father, who heard it from the famous lawgiver Solon. Solon, in turn, supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais, who had access to records written on temple walls going back 9,000 years before Solon's visit. So the chain looks like this: Egyptian temple inscriptions, priests of Sais, Solon, Critias's father, Critias's grandfather, Plato's character, Critias, Plato. That's a lot of telephone, according to this story. Long before known Greek history, there was a mighty island power beyond the Pillars of Heracles, usually taken to mean the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis. It was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, ringed with concentric harbours and canals, rich in metals, temples, and a powerful navy. The Atlanteans, children of Poseidon, began virtuous and orderly, but over time became greedy and imperial. They tried to conquer the Mediterranean. Standing in their way? A prehistoric Athens, a surprisingly modern-sounding, virtuous citizen-soldier democracy that resisted the Atlantean expansion and, according to Plato, defeated them. After which, in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, Atlantis sank beneath the sea, and the land around Athens was devastated, erasing most traces of this heroic past. On the surface, it sounds like straightforward lost civilization lore. Ancient documents, advanced islands, catastrophic floods, a missing continent. But Plato isn't a travel writer. He's a philosopher with an agenda. There are three main ways people have read this story. The first is as pure allegory. On this view, Plato invents Atlantis as a narrative device. He needs a powerful, wealthy, technologically impressive society to contrast with his ideal state. So he gives you a city that has everything: resources, engineering, imperial reach, and then shows you how moral decay and hubris destroy it. It's a myth of decline. A cosmic version of pride goes before a fall. The details line up neatly with his philosophical themes. Atlantis is ruled by kings descended from gods, but as they intermarry with mortals, their divine portion becomes diluted. They lose internal harmony, start chasing luxury, and justice collapses. Zeus convenes the gods to punish them. It's a morality play. In that reading, the Egyptian backstory is just a way of making the tale feel ancient and authoritative. I'm not making this up. I'm just passing on what the wise Egyptians recorded ages ago. The second interpretation is political. Plato is writing not long after the Persian Wars, when a vast Eastern empire tried, and failed to conquer the Greek world, and after the Peloponnesian War, when Athens itself swung from idealistic democracy to imperial bully and then disaster. Atlantis, in this light, is the Persians plus imperial Athens rolled into one cautionary example. A superpower with fleets and riches undone by overreach. Prehistoric Athens is the dream of what Athens could have been if it had stayed virtuous and philosophically guided. So the story functions as patriotic flattery and warning. We once were this noble, we could be again, but if we act like Atlantis, we know how that ends. The third interpretation is the one that keeps Atlantis alive in lost civilization circles. Maybe, people say, Plato really did hear a distorted version of real events. Maybe Egyptian priests had fragmentary records of some much older maritime culture in the Atlantic or Western Mediterranean. Maybe the numbers got garbled. 9,000 years becomes 900. Island becomes peninsula. But under all the philosophical dressing, there's a scattered memory of an actual place and disaster. If that's true, what could the candidates be? One obvious inspiration is the eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around the 16th century BC. A volcanic island blows its top in the Aegean, wiping out or crippling the sophisticated Minoan culture that dominated regional trade. Massive tsunamis, ashfall, sudden ruin of harbours and coastal towns. It's the kind of event that would echo in oral tradition for centuries. Another is Tartessos, a wealthy, semi-legendary civilization in southwestern Iberia mentioned by Greek and Phoenician sources. Rich in metals, maritime, somewhere near the Atlantic mouth of the Mediterranean. Its exact location and fate are still debated. If any Greek heard vague stories of a powerful western city that flourished and vanished, it could get spun into an Atlantic empire. Then there's a broader, less place-specific idea that Plato is repackaging a composite of ancient maritime powers, Minoans, Mycenaeans, Phoenicians, into one archetypal sea empire. Ships, canals, powerful fleets, far-flung colonies. It's not one city, but the memory of an entire Bronze Age system that once knit the Mediterranean together. Because something really did collapse. Around 1200 BC, the late Bronze Age world in that region fell apart. Major palace centres in Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond burned or were abandoned. Trade networks shrank. Writing systems disappeared in some areas for centuries. Egyptians carved desperate inscriptions about sea peoples attacking from the north. From inside that kind of systemic crash, it absolutely could feel like an age ending. People alive 2 or 3 centuries later might hear, "Once there were great cities. They traded across the sea. Then the gods sent famine and invasion, and the mighty were overthrown. Nothing is like it was. Fast forward another 800 years. A Greek lawgiver like Solon visits Egypt. Priests, who themselves inherit layered traditions and temple histories, talk about earlier ages, floods, and fallen kingdoms. Numbers and names drift in translation. A philosopher a century after that needs a dramatic example of noble cities and decadent empires. He pulls it all together into Atlantis. That doesn't mean there was literally a ringed island in the mid-Atlantic with anti-gravity crystal towers. It means there's a plausible pathway for real disasters and collapses, to harden into archetypal stories of a great civilization swallowed by water. So why does Atlantis, out of all such stories, refuse to die? Partly because it's narratively complete. Plato doesn't just say there was a city and it sank. He gives you geography, politics, architecture, resources, founding myths, military campaigns. It feels textured. You can imagine the streets. Partly because it comes with a built-in moral frame. Atlantis isn't just lost, it's deservedly lost. It serves as both a promise and a threat. If we become advanced and virtuous, we can be like early Atlantis or prehistoric Athens. If we become corrupt and arrogant, we will share their fate. That framing makes it easy to graft modern anxieties onto it: climate change, nuclear war, runaway tech, and partly because it leaves tantalizing blank space on the map. Plato places Atlantis just far enough away, and just long enough ago, that ordinary evidence will always be ambiguous. The Atlantic seafloor is enormous and hard to survey. Coastlines have shifted. Sea levels rose after the Ice Age. So there's always room to say, we haven't looked in the right spot yet. The real city is just over the horizon. If we're asking, though, are we the seventh civilization and was Atlantis one of the previous six, we need an evidentiary bar that isn't satisfied by vibes and narrative satisfaction. What would have to show up for Atlantis to move from story to site? You'd need a location that matches the core elements of Plato's account in a tight, testable way. Not somewhere in the ocean, but a specific region with clear geological evidence of a major, relatively sudden catastrophe at roughly the right time, massive subsidence, tsunami deposits, volcanic destruction. Archaeological remains of a complex urban maritime culture at that spot before the disaster, harbours, shipbuilding infrastructure, large-scale architecture, organised water management. Not just a fishing village. Material culture that plausibly connects to the world Plato knew, either through trade goods, linking it to the Bronze Age Mediterranean, or through a timeline that makes sense if memories travelled via Egypt. And ideally, independent textual or iconographic references from nearby cultures that hint at such a power, foreign inscriptions, shipwrecked cargoes, loanwords, so we're not hanging everything on one Greek philosopher. So far, despite a century of looking, no proposed Atlantis site clears that bar. Some have pieces. Thera has the cataclysm, Tartessos has the rich western harbour vibe, but nothing matches the whole package without stretching Plato to the breaking point. That doesn't make Atlantis useless to our question. It shows how easily real collapses, half remembered by later cultures, can be reshaped into a single mythical golden age that ends overnight. If cycles of civilization existed before ours, their last echo in later societies might look exactly like Plato's story, a moralized, compressed, geographically fuzzy tale of a world city that rose too high and drowned. To see whether anything like that actually happened, we have to leave philosophy and follow those collapses out into the wider world, where entire ages really did end in fire and flood, and where Indian texts talk not of one Atlantis, but of whole cycles of creation and destruction. In India, the before times go bigger than a single island. They go cosmic. Instead of one lost city that sinks once, you get time itself running on a loop, ages that rise, peak, decay, and reset, over and over. This is the yuga system. In mainstream Hindu cosmology, human history isn't seen as a straight line from primitive caves to smartphones. It's a cycle of 4 ages, Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali Yuga, collectively called a Mahayuga. In the earliest age, Satya Yuga, humans are supposed to be long-lived, virtuous, almost godlike. Each yuga that follows is shorter and more corrupt, until you get to Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel and decline. Depending on which tradition you read, a full cycle lasts millions of years. Then there are larger cycles stacked on top of that, manvantaras, kalpas, vast stretches of time that make even geological timescales feel like weekend plans. When you look at that through a modern lens, it's very easy to say, hang on. Multiple cycles of rising and falling ages, massive spans of time. Golden ages with higher knowledge, then a collapse into a dark age. Are they talking about previous high-tech civilizations? Some modern writers go further and claim that the yuga durations are encoded astronomical or even technological data, that Satya Yuga describes a world where people had psychic powers or advanced science, that Dvapara Yuga was some kind of half-remembered nuclear age, and that we're living amid the wreckage and amnesia. But before we sign on to that, we have to look at how these ages actually show up in the texts. The classic sources, the Puranas, the Mahabharata, present yugas as moral and spiritual epochs, not engineering manuals. The lengthening and shortening of lifespans, the waxing and waning of virtue, the rise and fall of dharma, cosmic order, the gigantic numbers, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, serve to push these cycles into mythic time. Time where gods incarnate, demons plot, and mountains grow wings. That doesn't rule out the possibility that distant memories of real events got wrapped into the framework. But the primary function is philosophical. The point is, nothing material lasts. Even gods have their seasons. Everything that rises will fall, and then rise again in some new form. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana take that cyclical backdrop and drop you into specific ancient eras, usually Treta Yuga for the Ramayana, Dvapara Yuga for the Mahabharata. This is where the lost civilization interpretations really take off, because these epics are loaded with imagery that to a modern technologist sounds suspiciously like weapons systems and aircraft. You get descriptions of vimanas, chariots of the gods that can move through the sky, across great distances, sometimes even between worlds. You get weapons like the Brahmastra, said to blaze like 1,000 suns to scorch the earth, to poison survivors. You get accounts of battles that leave the land infertile, the sky dark, the waters tainted. If you cherry-pick a few verses and translate them through 20th century trauma, it's easy to say, that's a nuclear blast. That's radiation fallout. That's an airplane. Some fringe authors do exactly this. They take a poetic description of a divine arrow that shines like the sun, roars like thunder, and blinds the enemy, and rewrite it as ancient laser weapon. Or they treat a palace that rose into the clouds as a literal steel and aluminum skyscraper. There are problems with that. First, the same texts also use those metaphors for completely uncontroversial things. A normal forest fire is compared to the end of the world. A king's anger is like the sun at the end of the age. God's vehicles are animals, clouds, mountains. Anything impressive becomes a vahana, a carrier. Second, the vimanas themselves are slippery. In some passages they're clearly magical flying chariots, powered by mantras run by gods or semi-divine heroes. In others they're just elaborately decorated carts. The later text often cited for technical vimana descriptions, the Vaimanika Shastra, was received by a 20th century mystic, and when engineers analysed it, its designs turned out to be aerodynamically nonsense. It's not an ancient Boeing manual, it's a modern channeled text dressed in Sanskrit and pseudo-technical language. That said, stripping all the sci-fi readings away and saying it's just a story misses something too. These epics are obsessive about geography, dynasties, and social detail. They name rivers and cities that we can locate. They preserve older layers of myth woven into what look like very human struggles for power, land, and legitimacy. Which brings us to the ground. What do we actually find in India's soil? The first major urban civilization in South Asia we can point to with confidence is the Indus Valley civilization, also called Harappan, after one of its key sites. Flourishing roughly 2600–1900 BC, centered in what's now Pakistan and northwest India, it's one of the four great Old World cradles of urbanism alongside Egypt, Mesopotamia and the Yellow River. What we see there is remarkable, even without UFOs. You get large planned cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, laid out on grid systems, standardized fired brick sizes across hundreds of kilometers, sophisticated drainage and sewage management that in some neighborhoods outclassed many later cities by millennia. Wells everywhere. Evidence of long-distance trade reaching Mesopotamia, with Indus seals found in Sumerian sites. Yet there are striking absences. No monumental pyramids or giant statues. No clear palaces or royal tombs. No deciphered writing, only short inscriptions on seals and tablets in a script we still can't read. Very little evidence of a warrior aristocracy or large-scale conquest. Power, if it existed in strong centralized form, wore a light architectural footprint. Then, around 1900 BC, the system fragments. Urban centers shrink or are abandoned. Standardization breaks down. The reasons are still being debated. Climate shifts affecting monsoons and rivers, changes in trade routes, internal social transformation, or some combination. So on one hand, India absolutely has a real complex urban civilization deep in its past, just not millions of years back, and not obviously blasting nukes from flying chariots. On the other hand, the collapse of that world and the slow emergence of later Vedic, epic and classical cultures leave plenty of gaps where cultural memory can get weird. Take Dwarka. In the Mahabharata and later traditions, Dwarka is the dazzling coastal city of Krishna, built by divine architects, rich, ordered, and eventually submerged by the sea after Krishna's departure. It's one of those golden city, sudden lost stories that sound like Atlantis in Indian dress. In the late 20th century, marine surveys off the coast of modern Dwarka and nearby sites like Betdwarka found submerged structures and artifacts. Stone blocks that look quarried and arranged, pottery fragments, anchor stones, enough to say, yes, there were ancient coastal settlements here that are now underwater. Some headlines jumped straight to Krishna's city found, or 12,000-year-old city under the sea. But when archaeologists actually dated the material, most of it clustered in the late Bronze and Iron Age, say 1500–500 BC. Old, but not impossibly so, and not clearly a single intact megacity, more a set of harbour structures and settlements that suffered the normal fate of low-lying coasts on a shifting, eroding shoreline. Are there older layers, possibly? Sea levels have risen since the last ice age. The west coast of India is complex, with river deltas and shifting sands that can cover or reveal structures. Some sonar images show patterns that could be human-made, but could be isn't are, and dating submerged stone is hard. Without clear in-situ artifacts or organic material, claims of 10,000-plus-year-old cities rest on very shaky ground. So what do we do with the epics themselves? Reading them responsibly means holding three things at once. First, they are not modern history books. They were compiled and edited over centuries, mixing mythic layers, theological arguments, didactic tales, and maybe kernels of historical events. The talking monkeys, shape-shifting demons, and divine weapons are not there to give you lab specs. Second, they can preserve cultural memories in distorted form. Wars between polities, the abandonment of cities, river course changes, even local floods or earthquakes can get mythologized into world-ending battles and divine retribution. When the Mahabharata talks about the end of Dvapara Yuga linked to a devastating war, part of that might be echoing real social upheavals at the tail end of the Bronze Age in the region. Third, they're saturated with metaphor and symbolism. Weapons that destroy worlds aren't just about physical damage. They're about moral catastrophe, the collapse of order. Flying chariots aren't just about transport. They're about transcendence, the connection between heaven and earth. To read them flatly as aerospace descriptions is like reading the Book of Revelation as a submarine maintenance manual. Where do the genuine mysteries sit? Some are textual. How old are the earliest layers of these epics, really? Oral composition can preserve themes for a long time before writing. But pinning dates is hard. Some are material. The undeciphered Indus script, the exact triggers of Harappan collapse, the nature of early Iron Age, states that step into the vacuum. There are also transitions that feel abrupt from our distance, from large, relatively anonymous Indus cities to smaller, more hierarchically explicit later cities, from a material culture we can't read to one anchored in Vedic ritual and epic narrative. In those gaps, it's easy and tempting to insert entire lost cycles of high technology. Could there have been earlier, more advanced cultures on the subcontinent before the Indus, wiped clean by time and monsoon? To move that from possibility to probability, we'd need the same kind of things we asked of Atlantis: clear, datable archaeological evidence of complex urbanism or large-scale engineering well before 3000 BC, and ideally multiple independent lines of support. So far, the record shows deep human antiquity in India. Stone tools going back hundreds of thousands of years, rock art, hunter-gatherer traditions, early farmers. Then by the 3rd millennium BC, a very real, very impressive urban civilization in the Indus. What it doesn't yet show is skyscrapers in Satya Yuga or jets in Devapara. What it does show through the Yuga cycles and epic imagination is a culture that was thinking hard about rise and fall, about long arcs of time, about remembered and forgotten ages. And that again is exactly the kind of mind that might preserve a faint echo if there really were civilizations before ours. To look for those echoes beyond India, we have to keep following the pattern. Myths of world ages, submerged cities, builders before the builders, across the ocean into the Americas. If India gives you yugas, Mesoamerica gives you suns. In central Mexican cosmology, especially as preserved by the Aztecs, you don't just have one creation, one history. You have a series of worlds, each with its own rules, its own peoples, and its own way of ending badly. This is the doctrine of the 5 suns. In broad outline, the story goes like this. The gods create a world, populate it, and something goes wrong. Jaguars eat everyone. Or hurricane winds strip people of their flesh and turn them into monkeys. Or fire rains from the sky. Or a flood wipes the slate clean. Each destruction is followed by a new beginning, a new sun, a new age of humanity. It's not a perfect one-to-one with Indian yugas, but the family resemblance is striking. Multiple world ages, repeated resets. Catastrophes that sound to a modern ear, like floods, storms, conflagrations, and a strong idea that we're living in a precarious late-stage world, the 5th sun, that could end if balance isn't maintained. The Maya, further south, don't talk about suns in quite the same way, but they're obsessed with time cycling. Their long count calendar famously tracks days from a mythic starting point in 3114 BC through massive spans called bactons. At the end of a big cycle, the odometer rolls over and a new era begins. The Popol Vuh, a key Kichi Maya text, tells of gods making multiple attempts at humanity, people of mud, people of wood, who fail and are destroyed before the successful maize people appear. To lost civilization enthusiasts, this all sounds like screaming subtext. We remember earlier iterations. We remember worlds before this one maybe, but we have to be careful about how we interpret world. Just like in India, these are not primarily technical manuals. They're cosmologies, moral dramas, explanations for why sacrifice matters, why the sun keeps moving, why humans owe a debt to the gods. The destructions are both literal and symbolic. Floods and fires stand for cosmic resets, but also for social chaos. Drought, famine, invasion, things these societies actually lived through. Still embedded in the myths are tantalizing hints of people before us. The Aztecs, for instance, talked constantly about the Toltecs. To them, Toltec didn't just mean a specific historical group from central Mexico. It became a kind of honorific for master artisan, wise person, original builder. In later Aztec storytelling, the Toltecs are the ones who knew the deep arts, who built magnificent cities, who had a level of refinement their successors could only imitate. Go back further and you get creator gods who act almost like culture heroes or teachers. Quetzalcoatl in some versions brings maize, teaches calendar keeping, introduces arts and governance. In the Maya area, deities and semi-divine ancestors are credited with giving humans writing, astronomy, agricultural rituals. Knowledge doesn't just arise, it's bestowed, and sometimes it feels like something being recovered. On the ground, we do see clear cases where builders before the builders is literally true, just not in the sci-fi way. Take the Olmec, flourishing roughly 1500–400 BC, along the Gulf Coast. They're famous for those colossal stone heads, some over 3 meters tall and weighing many tons. But beyond the meme, what you find are planned ceremonial centers, massive earthworks, possible early pyramid platforms, evidence of long-distance trade. They're one of the earliest complex societies in Mesoamerica and seem to have influenced later cultures' iconography, ball games, and maybe even aspects of writing and calendar. Then there's Teotihuacan, in the basin of Mexico, centuries later. At its height around 100–600 AD, it's a true metropolis, maybe 100,000 people or more. You get a rigid grid layout, a central avenue of the dead flanked by monumental pyramids, apartment compounds, plumbing, complex craft specialization. It predates the Aztecs by a millennium. By the time the Aztecs arrive on the scene, Teotihuacan is already an ancient ruin, venerable, mysterious. They name the big structures Pyramid of the Sun and Pyramid of the Moon, weave them into their own myths, and treat the site as a place where gods once walked. From their perspective, the question, who built this, is natural. The people who actually did are gone. The city's original name is lost. All you see are massive, eroded constructions far beyond anything your own polity has yet managed. Of course, you attribute it to mythic predecessors. We see a similar pattern with the Maya. Classic period Maya cities like Tikal, Palenque, and Calakmul show sophisticated urban planning, dynastic politics carved in stone, reservoirs, causeways, observatories aligned with celestial events. But even within the Maya world, later populations sometimes reoccupied or reinterpreted earlier sites. A modest village might grow up among the ruins of enormous temples. Local stories morph. Our ancestors built this in a time of great power, even if in reality there were multiple distinct phases of construction and abandonment over centuries. The calendar is where a lot of people reach for proof of advanced lost tech. The Maya could predict eclipses, track Venus cycles, and run interlocking calendars, the 260-day ritual cycle, the 365-day solar year, the long count through vast time spans. Their daykeepers and astronomer priests were very, very good at what they did. But being good at naked eye astronomy and base 20 arithmetic doesn't require satellites or computers. It requires long-term observation, record-keeping, pattern recognition, and a cultural commitment to watching the sky. The same goes for Aztec calendar stones and year counts. They're impressive, they're mathematically elegant, but they sit comfortably within what human societies can do with persistent effort and no modern technology. Where the myths of world ages intersect with archaeology most concretely is in the theme of catastrophe. We know that parts of the Maya lowlands went through severe drought episodes in the late Classic and Terminal Classic periods. Lake sediment cores, cave stalagmites, and other proxies show prolonged dry spells. Combine that with population pressure, deforestation, political infighting, and you get real collapses. Cities abandoned, monuments toppled or left half-finished, elites losing control. For the people living through that, it absolutely would have felt like a world ending. Later storytellers, looking back across generations at the jungle-covered remains of monumental cities and remembering only fragments of why they fell, are going to encode that as the gods destroyed a former age, or a previous people angered the powers and were wiped away. From our side, peering back across even longer spans, those same ruins can trigger the same question the Aztecs asked at Teotihuacan: who built this? Could it have been someone even earlier, even more advanced? Especially when we find a colossal pyramid buried under a later pyramid, or an older ceremonial platform reused by a newer culture. Layers on layers, like geological strata, invite stories about cycles and resets. So yes, in Mesoamerica we do find myths of multiple creations, memories of earlier peoples credited with superior skill, and real archaeological sequences where societies rise, build monumentally, fragment, and leave their successors puzzling over what came before. What we don't yet find is clear, datable evidence of a hidden technological civilization beyond what Olmec, Maya, Teotihuacan and their neighbours already were, brilliant Stone Age engineers and astronomers pushing pre-industrial techniques to their limits. But when you line up Mesopotamian floods, Indian yugas and Mesoamerican suns, a pattern emerges. Cultures all over the world thinking in terms of ages, cycles, destructions and rebuilds. That pattern is exactly where lost civilization theories like to live. To really stress test those theories, though, we have to leave mythic time and zoom in on the most recent, most concrete reset candidate of all, the end of the last ice age. At the end of the last ice age, something genuinely weird happened. From about 21,000 years ago onward, Earth was slowly thawing out. Massive ice sheets were retreating, sea levels were creeping up, climates were shifting. For thousands of years, the general trend was a bit warmer, a bit wetter, a bit friendlier to plants, animals and humans. Then, right when things were looking good, the planet seems to slam the brakes. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures in many regions dropped dramatically. In parts of the North Atlantic world, it got nearly as cold as full glacial conditions again. This chilly interval is called the Younger Dryas. It lasted roughly 1,200 years, and then, just as abruptly, the climate lurched back toward warmth. Not a gentle slope, but sharp steps in ice cores and sediment records that make climate scientists sit up straight. If you're someone who thinks in terms of civilizations and resets, that pattern is irresistible. Slow warming, people spreading into new lands, experimenting with new ways of living. Then a sudden cold shock, ecosystem disruption, megafauna extinctions, sea level jumps and meltwater pulses on either side of it. Then a new, warmer world. It feels like a cosmic switch being flipped. Old world off, new world on. Add to that another detail. This is exactly the window when, in a lot of alternative history circles, you start hearing about a supposedly advanced Ice Age culture. The claim goes something like this. Long before Egypt, Sumer or the Maya, there was a global or semi-global culture of hunter-gatherers plus. People who still used stone tools but also had refined astronomy, sophisticated surveying, maybe even some form of navigation and proto-engineering. They understood precession of the equinoxes. They tracked long celestial cycles. They knew geometry well enough to lay out perfect circles and alignments. Then the Younger Dryas hit. Their coastal settlements drowned or shattered, and only a handful of survivors made it through to seed later first civilizations with their knowledge. In this narrative, those survivors become the culture heroes of myth, the civilizing gods, the mysterious founders who pop up in stories from Turkey to Egypt to Mesoamerica. And the easiest place to pin that story in the real archaeological record is a site that genuinely does blow up our old timelines. Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey dates to around 9,600–8,000 BC, just after the Younger Dryas ends. It's older than Stonehenge by millennia, older than the pyramids by far. It consists of massive stone enclosures with T-shaped pillars, many over 5 meters tall, weighing multiple tons. The pillars are carved with animals, abstract symbols, sometimes humanoid features. There's planning, labor coordination, artistic convention, and the people who built it were, as far as we can tell, still hunter-gatherers or at best very early experimenters with domestication. That's already wild. Monumental architecture before full-blown agriculture. Organized symbolic construction before cities. Some researchers and popular writers go further. They argue that the layout of Göbekli Tepe encodes constellations, that certain animal symbols correspond to specific star patterns, that alignments mark solstices or even catastrophic events in the sky. In this reading, the site is not just a ritual center, it's a kind of stone database, preserving the memory of an earlier catastrophe, maybe even a comet strike that triggered the Younger Dryas. Which brings us to the comet. A group of scientists has proposed what's sometimes called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that fragments of a disintegrating comet slammed into North America or onto the ice sheets around 12,900 years ago, causing widespread fires, injecting dust into the atmosphere, disrupting climate, and contributing to the sudden cold reversal and the extinction of big Ice Age animals like mammoths. Proponents point to things like microscopic spherules, elevated platinum levels, and burnt layers at some archaeological and geological sites. In the more speculative versions, Göbekli Tepe is interpreted as a memorial to this event. Its carvings a sky map of doom preserved by the survivors of a lost elite. Critics push back hard. They note that many of the supposed impact markers can be produced by normal terrestrial processes: volcanism, wildfires, slow sedimentation. Some claimed evidence hasn't been replicated robustly at other sites. The timing of megafauna extinctions and human cultural shifts doesn't line up neatly with a single impact event everywhere. And the astronomical readings of Göbekli Tepe are, at this point, highly interpretive. You can map animal symbols to constellations if you want to, but that doesn't mean the builders intended that mapping. So the comet hypothesis remains contentious. Interesting enough that people keep testing pieces of it, far from settled enough to use as a foundation for there was a wiped-out global civilization. On the more conservative side, archaeologists see Göbekli Tepe and other early sites in the region, like Nevali Chori or Karahan Tepe, as evidence that complex ritual centers and large-scale cooperation can emerge among foragers without cities, writing, or metals. The transition to farming and settled villages in that area looks gradual and locally driven. You don't need a ghost civilization to explain it. And that's the key question. If there really had been a civilization at least as advanced as, say, the Bronze Age world living before or during the Younger Dryas, and then wiped out, what would it actually leave behind? Think about what our own industrial civilization is doing to the planet. We're carving open-pit mines that are visible from orbit. We're leaving mountains of slag and tailings, concrete, rebar, synthetic chemicals, plastic. We're burning so much fossil fuel that we're literally altering the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans in ways that will be detectable in sediments for tens of millions of years. Dial that back. Imagine a smaller, less global, but still advanced Ice Age society. Maybe they never reach fossil fuels, but they do widespread metallurgy. Smelting leaves characteristic waste, slag piles, furnace remains, metal droplets in soil. Large-scale mining leaves, tunnels, adits, pits, deforested landscapes, distinctive patterns of heavy metal contamination. Even if sea level rise drowned coastal cities, and it did drown coastal land, we know that upland quarries, mines and workshop sites would remain. Durable materials like fired ceramics, metal alloys, glass, and certain kinds of stoneworking would show up in stratified datable contexts older than 12,000 years. We'd find copper or bronze tools clearly out of place in Paleolithic layers, not as one-off anomalies with dubious provenance, but as repeated, consistent patterns. So far we don't. What we do find around the end of the Ice Age and into the early Holocene is a global pattern of hunter-gatherers and early farmers getting more organized, more inventive, more symbolically expressive. We see the first large ritual complexes, the first hints of domestication, more intensive fishing, more specialized toolkits, more elaborate art. A long, messy region-by-region ramp-up, not a crisp before and after from lost tech society to us. The Younger Dryas is real. Its climate whiplash is real. Human populations living through it absolutely would have experienced local collapses, migrations, and cultural breaks that could echo as world reset stories in later myth. Whether that includes memories of a truly advanced, now vanished Ice Age civilization is still an open question in the sense that science can't prove a universal negative. But right now, the extraordinary evidence you'd want to see Clear, repeated signs of industry, metallurgy, or global-scale engineering older than 12,000 years just isn't there. What we're left with is a powerful tension, a planetary near miss that feels like the perfect stage for a reset. Astonishing early monuments like Göbekli Tepe that show humans were ready to build big and think symbolically the moment conditions allowed. Myths of floods and fire and teacher gods arriving after catastrophe. And alongside all that, the sober reminder that compelling stories aren't data. If we're going to claim that our civilization is the seventh in a long, hidden line, we can't stop at "it would be cool if." We have to ask, where exactly are the fingerprints? Because if there really were 6 advanced civilizations before us, and if any of them were even close to what we are now, they shouldn't just haunt our myths. They should be burned into the rocks, which brings us to the people who say they've seen those rocks, or at least read about them in secret books. The idea that somewhere in hidden archives and private collections, the true records of those earlier worlds are locked away from public view. If you can't find the evidence in the ground, the next move is obvious. You put it in a book no one else is allowed to see. This is where secret record stories come in. Instead of ruins and artifacts, the proof for earlier civilizations is said to live in hidden archives, mystery schools, esoteric orders. The narrative shifts from "we haven't dug in the right place yet" to someone already dug, already knew and decided not to tell you. A lot of these stories trace back to a surprisingly small set of traditions. In the ancient world, big temple complexes did keep archives. Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, Mesoamerica. If you had a priestly class, you usually had stored texts, ritual instructions, astronomical observations, king lists. Access wasn't democratic. Literacy was rare. Knowledge was power. So you really did get a 2-tier system. Initiates on the inside, everyone else getting the edited public version. Fast forward to late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and those priestly roles morph into things like philosophical schools, Gnostic groups, Sufi orders, monastic libraries. Again, you see a pattern. Outer teachings for most people, inner teachings for those who commit to years of training and prove themselves trustworthy. That's not necessarily nefarious. Sometimes it's just a way of making sure complex ideas aren't garbled. But by the time you hit the colonial era, something else happens. European travellers arrive in India, Egypt, Tibet, West Africa, places with deep living traditions and piles of texts they can't read. They catch half-translated stories about cycles of ages, earlier worlds, lost cities. Those stories then get filtered through their own expectations, their own religious and philosophical agendas, and come home to Europe and America with an extra layer of drama. That's the soil in which movements like theosophy grow. Theosophical writers in the 19th and early 20th centuries claimed access to hidden Mahatmas, or spiritual masters in Tibet and India, keepers of ancient wisdom preserved from vanished civilizations like Lemuria and Atlantis. They published elaborate cosmologies, root race theories, timelines of cycles and cataclysms. The sources, often secret books, astral reading, or teachings from masters whose identities and manuscripts could never quite be independently verified. Later, esoteric groups recycled and remixed that material. You get claims that the Vatican holds proof of pre-flood technology in underground vaults, that certain Tibetan monasteries guard metal books or crystal discs from a pre-Ice Age world, that Egyptian temple priests maintained unbroken lineages stretching back to a civilization far older than any pharaoh on the king lists. Important distinction. These are claims. They might be preserving genuine fragments of older myths and memories. They might also be doing what esoteric traditions often do, using the authority of the hidden to make their particular worldview feel weightier, more cosmic. And that's the psychological engine behind suppression narratives. When someone says, "the real history is locked away by elites," it does a few powerful things at once. It explains the lack of public evidence. You don't see it because they won't show you. It flatters the listener. You're one of the few who can handle the truth. And it makes the story hard to disprove, because the proof is, by definition, somewhere you can't check. Rhetorically, it's very effective. Any pushback can be framed as part of the cover-up. Skeptical archaeologists become gatekeepers. Translators who disagree becomes biased censors. The absence of data becomes evidence of how deep the conspiracy goes. Now, to be fair, there are real-world practices that rhyme with this. There really are restricted collections. The Vatican Apostolic Library has sections only qualified researchers can access. Many monasteries in Asia and Europe have manuscripts that have barely been catalogued. Museums and universities have storerooms full of cuneiform tablets, ostraca, inscriptions that no one has gotten around to translating yet. Academic gatekeeping is also a thing. To publish certain ideas in serious journals, you need credentials, track records, and your argument has to be framed in a very specific technical language. That can absolutely make the system feel hostile to outsiders or to radical ideas that don't fit the current consensus. But there's a big difference between slow, imperfect, sometimes snobby human institutions and a coordinated global effort to hide 6 entire civilizations. If you want to navigate this without either swallowing every claim or dismissing everything as nonsense, there's a simple method you can use: chase the footnotes. When you hear that ancient Indian texts clearly describe flying machines from a previous age, ask, which text exactly? What verse? What manuscript? Can I see a scholarly edition or a critical translation, not just an esoteric summary? When someone quotes secret Egyptian priestly records, track the citation back. Is it coming from a Greek writer like Plato or Herodotus, reporting what priests supposedly told him? From a 19th century occultist paraphrasing what they heard from a local informant? Or from an actual hieroglyphic inscription you can find in a museum catalogue? Pay attention to translation context. Sanskrit, hieroglyphs, cuneiform. These languages are subtle. Words that get rendered as airships or energy weapons in paranormal books might be translated as chariots of the gods or divine weapons in mainstream philology, with the technology part coming entirely from the interpreter's imagination. And notice when an argument leans heavily on unverifiable authority. I read it in a rare book you can't access is not the same as here's a digitized manuscript and multiple independent translations you can compare. Secrecy, in other words, is plausible in small, bounded ways. It is absolutely true that not all knowledge is equally accessible, that some archives are underfunded, understudied, or politically sensitive. It is possible that a text sitting in a monastery basement somewhere contains a mythic memory of a flood 10,000 years older than we expected. But secrecy also makes it easy to build castles in the air. The more your story depends on documents no one can see, languages no one else can read, lineages no one can independently confirm, the less it functions as history, and the more it functions as myth. And if we're trying to figure out whether we're really the 7th civilization, myth alone isn't enough. Which means we have to turn next to the physical gotchas people point to, the out-of-place artifacts that are supposed to blow up the whole timeline. Once you leave the world of secret books and hidden masters, the next stop is almost always the museum case, or the mine shaft, or the blurry photo of something they don't want you to know about. These are the uparts, out-of-place artifacts. Objects that supposedly shouldn't exist where or when they're found. A metal sphere in billion-year-old rock, a spark plug in a geode, a machine part in a coal seam, a precision-cut stone with no quarry, no tools, no explanation. They spread like wildfire online for a few simple reasons. First, the story structure is perfect. One image, one shocking caption, one punchline. Mainstream science can't explain this. It takes you 3 seconds to get the gist, and it feels like you're seeing behind the curtain. Second, verifying the claim is hard. You'd need the original excavation report, stratigraphy diagrams, lab notes, access to the actual object. Most people have a phone and 5 spare minutes, so the meme wins by default. Third, the emotional hit is enormous. An UPART promises not just a mystery but a vindication. You were right to suspect the official story. When you actually dig into case after case, though, patterns start to repeat. One pattern: misdated strata. An object really is found in a mine or a rock layer, but the context gets garbled. A 19th century miner drops a tool down a crack. Decades later, someone chips it out from the coal seam and assumes it's as old as the coal. Or an artifact erodes into older sediment through an animal burrow or a fissure, and without careful recording it looks like it was always there. Another pattern: hoaxes and tall tales. The aluminum wedge of Iude, supposedly a 250,000-year-old machined object, turns out to be modern alloy likely used on construction equipment. The Kozo artifact, a spark plug-like object in a concretion, gets X-rayed and looks exactly like a 1920s spark plug inside hardened sediment. Stories of gold chains in coal or iron pots in rock usually trace back to a century-old newspaper anecdote with no specimen, no sample, no way to check. Third pattern: misunderstood industrial-era stuff. We're surrounded by weirdly shaped parts, valves, couplers, machine fragments. Once they break off, rust, or mineralize, they stop looking familiar. Show that to someone 100 years later without context, and it's easy to project ancient high-tech onto what is basically scrap. And then there are the headlines: ancient precision machining. Impossible engineering proves lost super-civilization. If you chase the article back to the original paper, you often find something completely different. The actual study might say, "We used 3D scanning to quantify tool marks on this megalith, which suggests repeated abrasion with stone tools over long periods." The headline turns that into laser-like cuts no one can explain. That doesn't mean everything is fake or boring. Real anomalies do exist. Archaeology and geology are messy, and the world does not always present itself in neat textbook diagrams. The important thing is what happens next. In science, a genuine anomaly isn't a mic drop. It's a starting gun. The first question is the data real? That means checking for contamination, re-examining the site, repeating the dating with different methods, radiocarbon, optically stimulated luminescence, uranium series, whatever fits. Other teams try to replicate the findings in different places. Specialists argue about alternative explanations. Sometimes the anomaly dissolves under better measurements. Sometimes it survives. When it does, models get revised. Neanderthal jewellery was once an anomaly. So were sophisticated stone tools older than our species. Both provoked long debates, multiple rounds of testing, and eventually a changed consensus. Other human species were smarter and more symbolic than we'd given them credit for. That's how a real shock to the system looks. Slow, contested, but cumulative. Megalithic precision is a great example of how this process works, and how the online version can drift. You hear claims like, "We can't replicate this today," or "These joints are so perfect, they must have used lasers." The Inca walls at Cusco, the polygonal masonry at Sacsayhuaman, the fitted stones at Baalbek, the casing blocks of the Great Pyramid, the drill cores from ancient Egypt, these all get pulled into the narrative. When engineers and stoneworkers actually study them, they find something impressive but not magical. You see long, patient abrasion with harder stones and sand. Copper or bronze tools repeatedly hammered, sharpened and discarded, levering and pounding, ropes and sledges, wetting wooden wedges so they expand in pre-cut grooves and crack rock. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of labourers over decades. Trial and error over generations, with enough time and social organization, centimeter-level precision, or better, is achievable with simple tools. We know because modern experimental archaeologists and craftspeople have reproduced many of these techniques. Not at the full monumental scale, because no one is funding a second Giza plateau, but at a scale large enough to show the methods are plausible. Is everything fully understood? No. There are still arguments over exactly how certain blocks were transported, how specific cuts were made, how some drill marks were produced. But the gap is between we have several competing low-tech methods, and we know nothing. You don't have to smuggle in alien CNC machines to explain it. So what would a real, undeniable, civilization-shattering artifact look like? It would have to tick a few boxes at once. First, the context would be airtight. Not found in a rock in someone's garage, but excavated by a team in a sealed, well-documented layer, with stratigraphy photographed and logged. Ideally, multiple independent digs in different places. Second, the object itself would be unambiguous. Not this stone kind of looks like a gear, but something that only makes sense as advanced technology. A microchip-like structure with complex doping layers, synthetic polymers with cross-linked chains that don't form in nature, alloys with precise ratios and manufacturing signatures unknown before the Industrial Revolution. Third, the dating would have to survive attack. Different labs, different methods, converging on a time way outside the known technological curve. Not one lonely radiocarbon number, but a network of evidence. Associated fossils, volcanic ash layers, paleomagnetism, trapped charge dating. If we ever found a stainless steel-like component, made with 20th century grade metallurgy, inside an undisturbed, well-dated Miocene sediment layer, and it survived years of scrutiny, that would be a genuine game-changer. The textbooks would not quietly ignore it. Entire careers would form around explaining it, because overturning big ideas is how scientists become famous. Until something like that shows up, though, most alleged OOPArts sit in a different folder. Not definitely fake, not definitely proves Atlantis. More like, maybe. Interesting. Needs more data. That's the mindset that actually keeps you closest to the truth. Be curious enough to look up the excavation report. Suspicious enough to notice when all the sources loop back to a 1970s UFO magazine. Open enough to accept that sometimes the wild claim was onto something, but only after the evidence holds up under pressure. You don't have to choose between smug dismissal and blind belief. You can build a maybe shelf in your mind, where strange objects and odd results can sit while more information arrives. Because the real question isn't, are there any anomalies? There are always anomalies. The real question is whether those anomalies taken together demand an entire lost global civilization, or whether they tell a different, more complicated story about how humans and our stories evolve over time. To answer that, we have to zoom out from single objects and look at the bigger pattern. What could an earlier advanced civilization leave behind, and could we miss it? If you want to hide a stone hand axe, that's easy. If you want to hide a global industrial civilization, that's much harder. Because once you start burning through energy and rearranging the planet at scale, you don't just leave pyramids and statues. You leave chemistry. You dump weird ratios of carbon isotopes into the atmosphere and oceans. You concentrate heavy metals in odd places. You manufacture molecules that literally never existed before your species came along. That's the starting point of something called the Silurian hypothesis. It's named after a race of intelligent reptiles from an old British sci-fi show, but the idea itself is dead serious. A couple of planetary scientists asked if there had been an industrial civilization on Earth tens or hundreds of millions of years ago, what would we see now? And, more importantly, what would we miss? They weren't thinking about Atlantis. They were thinking about exoplanets. How do you tell, from far away, if a planet once had industry that's now gone? Earth is the only test case we have. When they looked at our own footprint, they didn't start with skyscrapers. Buildings are fragile at geological timescales, give erosion, plate tectonics and glaciation a few million years, and even New York turns into anonymous sand. Instead, they focused on signals that get baked into the rocks. One is carbon. Our fossil fuel binge takes carbon that's been locked up underground for hundreds of millions of years and dumps it into the air in a geological eye blink. That leaves a very specific fingerprint, a rapid shift in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13, combined with warming, ocean deoxygenation, and mass extinction patterns. When geologists look back in deep time, they do see events with somewhat similar signatures, spikes of weird carbon, rapid warming ecosystem crashes. They have names like the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Nobody thinks they're proof of dinosaur factories. They're explained by massive volcanic episodes, methane releases, changing ocean circulation. But the key point is this. If someone was looking at our time from 60 million years in the future, and all our buildings were long gone, they'd still see a sharp, global, industrial-looking signal in the rocks. That's the kind of thing a truly advanced civilization should leave. Synthetic materials are another. Plastics, for example, don't just vanish. They break down, fragment, and get buried. Already microplastics are in deep-sea sediments and Arctic ice. Some geologists think we're on track to create a distinct plastiglomerate layer, a mashup of plastic fused with sand and rock that could survive as a strange artificial rock for millions of years. Then there are industrial alloys, aluminum in high-purity forms, stainless steels, exotic superalloys. Many of these don't occur naturally in large, refined quantities. Their corrosion products, their precise elemental ratios, the way they're distributed in sediments and mine tailings, those are all clues. On top of that, you get radioactive signatures. Nuclear reactors and weapons tests leave distinctive isotopes and isotope ratios that don't match any known natural process. Some decay on the order of tens of thousands of years. Others leave daughter products and anomalies that can persist much longer. Stack all of this together, carbon shifts, metal concentrations, synthetic polymers, isotopic oddities, and you get what scientists sometimes call a technofossil layer, a chemical scar in the geologic record. If there was a truly global industrial-scale civilization, hundreds of thousands or millions of years before us, something like this should exist. Maybe not identical, but comparable. Not in one cave or a single core sample, but across multiple sites, in multiple continents, tied to a specific slice of geological time. So far we don't see that. We see local anomalies, weird events, natural catastrophes, but nothing that screams planet-wide industry before our own. That sounds pretty damning, until you remember how bad we are at actually sampling the planet. Most humans and most complex societies cluster along coasts and rivers. That's where the fish and fertile soils are. That's where trade routes form. That's where cities rise, but coastlines move. At the height of the last ice age, sea level was about 120 meters lower than today. Huge stretches of what are now continental shelves were dry land, prime real estate for human groups. Any coastal settlements from that time are now underwater, buried under meters of sediment. If an earlier civilization also loved coastlines, and why wouldn't it? A huge fraction of its cities would be in the same danger zone. Ice sheets melt, sea levels rise, shorelines retreat. Ports, warehouses, suburbs, all drowned, then smoothed over by waves, mud, and time. Even on land, sites don't sit still. Civilizations are recyclers. If you find a nice hilltop with good water and good views, You don't build a brand new city next door to the old ruins. You build right on top of them. You quarry the previous city's stones. You reuse foundations. You melt down old metal. Layer after layer of occupation compresses into a single messy stack. We see this all over the world in the Near East. You get tells, artificial mounds that are literally cities piled on cities. In Europe and Asia, medieval fortresses sit on top of Roman forts, which sit on top of Iron Age hill forts, which sit on top of Neolithic settlements. Archaeologically, that's time compression. Thousands of years of history can be folded into a few meters of debris. If there were an earlier high-tech layer under all that, later cultures would strip it, repurpose it, and overwrite it. By the time modern excavators arrive, the traces might be extremely fragmentary. So yes, there are blind spots, drowned coastlines, eroded floodplains, unexcavated tells, entire regions no one's ever surveyed. But the blind spots are shrinking. In the last couple of decades, archaeologists have gotten new superpowers. LiDAR, laser scanning from aircraft, can strip away vegetation in the data and reveal what's underneath. Hidden city grids under jungle canopy, terrace systems on mountain slopes, road networks you'd never see from the ground. Satellite imaging does something similar at larger scales. Subtle differences in plant growth, soil moisture, or surface texture can betray buried walls, canals, even whole lost towns. Algorithms can comb through petabytes of imagery looking for those faint signatures automatically. On the ground, radar and other geophysical tools let you see through soil without digging a single trench. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, electrical resistivity, all ways of mapping foundations, pits and voids while leaving the site intact. And then there's the ocean. Underwater archaeology used to mean a few divers and some luck. Now you have multi-beam sonar, autonomous underwater vehicles, sub-bottom profilers. We're starting to map drowned landscapes, ancient river valleys, and submerged shorelines in surprising detail. Put this together, and our ability to spot large-scale organized human activity, roads, fields, monumental architecture has exploded. Entire urban complexes in places like the Amazon and Cambodia have emerged from empty jungle. Dense networks of ancient sites are turning up on continental shelves and along paleo coastlines. So where does that leave the seventh civilization idea? On the one hand, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There are vast areas we still haven't sampled. Geological processes erase a lot. A civilization that was mostly coastal, that didn't burn much fossil carbon, that used biodegradable materials, that stayed relatively small and regionally contained. It could be surprisingly hard to see after hundreds of thousands of years. On the other hand, scale matters. A truly global advanced civilization shipping goods between continents, mining at industrial levels, altering the atmosphere, using complex synthetics, should leave global, industrial-looking fingerprints. Not just myths and a handful of ambiguous objects, but big, coherent signals in the rocks and sediments that multiple scientific fields would keep stumbling over. We haven't found that layer yet. That doesn't close the case. It just sets the bar. If we're going to claim 6 whole civilizations before ours, we have to ask, do the stories and anomalies we've looked at so far rise to that level? Or are they hinting at something smaller, stranger, and more local? To answer that, we need to step back from fossils and cities for a moment and look at ourselves, at why we crave origin stories that run deeper than the dirt under our feet. There's a reason these stories get under our skin. 6 civilizations before ours, worlds before the flood, ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. On the surface, they're just myths, just old stories. But they keep coming back in different cultures, in different eras, wearing different masks. They're doing a job for us. Origin stories are not just about the past. They're about who we think we are right now and who we're afraid we might become. If you live in a world where your city can be destroyed overnight by an earthquake, your origin stories tend to be about chaos and gods fighting monsters. If you live in a world where you can destroy yourself with nuclear weapons or runaway climate change, your origin stories start to sound like cautionary tales about civilizations that flew too close to the sun. When we hear about advanced societies before ours, four big themes usually show up. The first is identity. If your culture can trace its roots back to an earlier, wiser age, then you're not just another group of primates who accidentally invented smartphones. You're the latest chapter of a much grander story. We are the remnants of a greater world. We are the people who survived the last ending. That's powerful. It turns your struggles into something epic. The second is humility. Lost civilization stories whisper, "You're not the first. You will not be the last. You are not as special as you think." That can be a relief. It shrinks our ego down to size. It says, relax. The universe has seen this movie before. Empires rise, empires fall. You are one wave in a very long tide. But it can also be unsettling, because if there were others like us and they vanished, then our survival is not guaranteed either. Which brings us to the third theme, warning. Almost every narrative about a previous high civilization ends the same way, catastrophe. Sometimes it's a flood, sometimes a fire, sometimes divine judgment, sometimes just entropy. Corruption, hubris. These stories function like a black box report from a crashed airplane. Here's how they went down. Don't pull the same stunt. You see this in Plato's Atlantis, in Mesopotamian flood myths, in Hindu yuga cycles, in Mesoamerican world ages. People imagine technological or spiritual peaks, followed by sudden collapse. You get this sense that there's a ceiling on how far a civilization can push its luck before something snaps. And the fourth theme is wonder. We like the idea that the universe has hidden chapters, that beneath the layers of sand and silt and time, there's still a mystery big enough to surprise us. A blueprint, maybe, or a message in a bottle from another age. Part of us wants the archaeologist's trowel to hit something no one can explain with the usual tools. Not just a new city or a new king, but a whole lost way of being human. Now here's where our modern brains complicate things. We don't read ancient texts the way their authors wrote them. We read them through the lens of electricity, spaceflight, the internet, nuclear physics. When a Bronze Age scribe describes a shining chariot descending from the sky, we don't think weird, poetic metaphor about a storm god. Our first instinct is, oh, is that a UFO? When a myth talks about weapons that burn like 1,000 suns, we think nuclear blast, not someone trying to describe lightning with zero knowledge of plasma physics. We project our technology backward. Ancient cities of gold become high-tech metropolises. Flying palaces become aircraft. Divine weapons become lasers. Scribes of the gods become extraterrestrial engineers or survivors of an earlier, smarter humanity. Sometimes that's just playful imagination. Sometimes people are dead serious. Either way, it's us, not them, supplying those details. And that's fine, as long as we remember we're doing it. That's really the balance this whole topic demands. On one side you have skepticism, the willingness to ask annoying questions. Does this claim match the evidence? Is there a simpler explanation? Is this translation reliable, or did someone massage it to fit their theory? On the other side you have imagination, the willingness to say, okay, but what if? What if we're missing a pattern? What if that tradition is preserving a distorted memory of a real event? If you throw out skepticism, you can believe anything. If you throw out imagination, you never notice when the data is quietly telling you something new. For the rest of this video, I want both in the room. The part of you that loves big, wild possibilities, and the part that wants receipts. speaking of big possibilities, there's one quick thing to mention before we dive into ranking these 6 alleged civilizations. If you're the kind of person who watches long videos about deep time, myths, and lost worlds, you are exactly the person we wrote a book for. We put together a sleepy time history book that takes this same kind of slow, story-driven journey through other strange corners of the past, civilizations, disasters, turning points, designed to be calming enough to fall asleep to, but detailed enough that you actually learn something along the way. If that sounds like your kind of thing, you can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week. No pressure at all, but if you want a way to keep exploring this stuff offline, that's there for you. Now back to our 7 civilization puzzle. We've collected the raw material: myths, religious texts, anomalous artifacts, geological clues, and the very real constraints of archaeology and planetary science. The next step is to put them on the same table and start sorting. Which of the 6 alleged worlds before ours have at least some support from independent evidence, climate events, real cities under later cities, datable floods, cultural continuity? Which ones fall apart the moment you tug on their timelines, or check their sources? Where are the genuine mysteries that even conservative scholars admit we haven't fully explained? And where are we mostly looking at misunderstandings, mistranslations, or 19th century speculations that refuse to die? We're going to rank these 6 candidates from most grounded in something real to almost certainly symbolic, invented, or wildly stretched. And as we do that, keep that 2-part mindset handy. Let your imagination lean in when a story lines up with surprising data. Let your skepticism speak up when the evidence gets thin or selective. Because if we're ever going to seriously argue that we are the 7th civilization, we need to know which, if any, of the previous 6 even make it past the first round of scrutiny. So let's start that ranking, beginning with the traditions that have the strongest anchors in archaeology and history, and then working our way out to the edges where the questions get bigger and the ground beneath our feet starts to feel a lot less solid. To keep this honest, we need some ground rules. Let's build a simple framework we can use for all 6 previous civilizations. 4 questions, same ones every time. First, textual tradition strength. Are we dealing with a vague myth mentioned once, or a set of texts copied, commented on, argued over for centuries? The more stable and detailed the tradition, the better chance it's preserving something. Second, archaeological support. Do we have ruins, layers, bones, tools that line up roughly with what the story is talking about? Not perfect matches, those never happen, but enough overlap that we can say, yeah, this part belongs in the same universe. Third, geological plausibility. If the story claims a world-destroying flood, do we see evidence of massive flooding in that region at roughly the right time? If it claims cities sunk beneath the sea, do we see any sign of that on the ocean floor, or at least major sea level rise that could drown coastal settlements? And fourth, independent corroboration. Do other cultures or other sciences point to the same kind of event without being obviously copied from the same source? When you run our 6 candidates through that filter, you don't get certainty. But you do get a spectrum from this is almost certainly a cultural memory of real disasters and real social collapse to this is probably a philosophical story that people later took way too literally. Let's start on the stronger end. Mesopotamia's antediluvian world and India's cycles of ages both score high on textual tradition. You're looking at literatures that go back thousands of years with multiple versions, commentaries and cross-references. On the archaeological side, Mesopotamia does very well because we can literally dig down through stacked cities. We see older urban layers under later ones. We see flood deposits in some places. We see long sequences of kings interrupted by periods where sites are abandoned or radically reorganized. That doesn't prove a single global deluge, but it absolutely fits a pattern of repeated, serious river floods and political resets being mythologized as the world before the flood, and the world after. Geologically, that's solid too. The Tigris-Euphrates region is flood-prone. Sea levels have fluctuated. There were real, terrifying inundations in deep prehistory, like the filling of the Black Sea basin that could echo through stories. Independent corroboration, you get flood stories and before-after language all along the Near East. It's not one scribe's fan fiction, it's a regional trauma response. India's yugas are more cosmic and abstract, but they also sit on top of real old cities and real deep time. The archaeological record of the subcontinent shows sophisticated urbanism in the Indus Valley by 2600 BCE, long before many later texts were compiled. You get evidence of climate shifts, river course changes, city abandonment. Layer that with a philosophical tradition obsessed with cycles, and you can see how real rise and fall patterns get stretched into multi-million-year world ages. So, strongest clues here point not to iPads in the Bronze Age, but to real collapses, real floods, and a tendency for later cultures to compress and dramatize deep history into worlds or ages before theirs. Next up in the grounded but embellished tier are the Mesoamerican world ages. Textual tradition is moderate. We don't have as many pre-contact books, thanks to colonial book burning, but we do have surviving codices, later transcriptions, and oral accounts. Archaeology is excellent. The Americas are full of literal builders before the builders, earlier pyramid complexes under later ones, older ball courts abandoned and replaced. Geologically, we know Central America has seen volcanic eruptions, droughts, and seismic events that can wreck societies. We've got tree ring and lake sediment records for major climate swings. Corroboration shows up in multiple cultures, Maya, Aztec, others who all talk about previous suns or epochs that end in catastrophe. Again, nothing here screams jet engines, but everything screams we remember that there were people before us who built big things and then something terrible happened. Now let's bring in the Ice Age advanced culture hypothesis, because this is where Göbekli Tepe quietly walks on stage. If you're ranking by textual tradition alone, the Ice Age idea looks weak. There are no written records from 12,000 years ago. What people usually do instead is point to myths, like flood stories or culture heroes teaching farming, and assume they're about the end of the last Ice Age. But on the archaeological side, something important did happen around that time, and it moved this idea from pure speculation into, okay, now we need to think carefully. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is older than agriculture in that region, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids by a wide margin. You have massive T-shaped stone pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circles, and crucially, they were built by hunter-gatherers, not full-time farmers. That tells us two things. First, the timeline for monument building and complex ritual spaces is earlier than we assumed. You don't need big cities and bureaucrats to organize large labor projects. Small, mobile groups with strong social networks can shape stone on a monumental scale. Second, our picture of simple Ice Age and early Holocene societies was way too flat. These people had planning, specialization, symbolic systems, probably stories and rituals deep enough to motivate decades of work. Does that mean there was a single global Atlantis-style Ice Age civilization? No. Göbekli Tepe is local. Different regions show their own trajectories. But it does mean that an earlier civilization-like complexity, ritual centers, regional networks, shared iconography, was on the table much earlier than 3000 BCE. In our framework, the Ice Age hypothesis scores low on textual tradition, moderate on geology, because there really were catastrophic meltwater pulses and sea level rise, and intriguingly high on archaeological surprise. It's not proof of lost airplanes, but it's a big nudge to stop treating 10,000 BCE as a uniform grey fog. Now, Atlantis and Egypt's first time sit in a different, trickier category. Plato's Atlantis has a strong textual footprint in one very specific sense, a clear origin. It appears in two dialogues with a stated philosophical purpose. There's no earlier Greek record of Atlantis as a known tradition. Archaeologically, every serious attempt to pin it to a specific site, Santorini, the Atlantic, the Caribbean, runs into dating problems or scale issues. Geologically, we have real tsunamis and island eruptions, but not a vanished supercontinent in the last 12,000 years. Independent corroboration? Not really. Later writers are mostly riffing on Plato. So Atlantis is compelling because it hits all our emotional buttons about hubris and downfall, but in terms of evidence, it looks like a philosophical thought experiment that later people retrofitted into pseudo-history. Egypt's Zep Tepi, the first time, has almost the opposite problem. The textual tradition is genuinely ancient and woven into religious language. There are real debates about how to interpret references to earlier followers of Horus or seemingly impossibly old reigns. But when you move to archaeology and chronology, dynastic Egypt is one of the best dated cultures on Earth. The physical evidence for pharaonic civilization goes back to about 3100 BCE, with clear precursors in the predynastic period. Do we see a hidden high-tech civilization under that? No. We see continuity, gradual elaboration of tombs, administrative complexity, experimentation that leads up to the classic Old Kingdom pyramids. The earlier talk looks more like mythic deep time and divine rule layered onto a very real, very traceable human story. So where does that leave our six? Mesopotamian antediluvian worlds, Indian yugas, and Mesoamerican ages. Strong candidates for cultural memories of real floods, climate swings and collapses, translated into mythic language. The Ice Age advanced culture idea? Not supported as a single global civilization, but no longer easy to dismiss. Thanks to sites like Göbekli Tepe and early monumental traditions that blur the line between foragers and civilized builders, Egypt's first time and Plato's Atlantis. Powerful narratives, deeply meaningful to the cultures that carried them, but with weak archaeological and geological anchors for literal earlier high-tech societies. They tell us more about how people thought about origins than about any hidden layer of skyscrapers under Giza. And this is where that last piece of the framework comes in: uncertainty. We don't have to pretend we know exactly what every myth refers to. We don't have to force every story to match a specific flood layer, or every legend to be either 100% true or complete nonsense. Uncertainty here is not failure. It's the frontier. It's the space where new digs, new dating methods, new translations can still surprise us. If there were 6 civilizations before ours, whether you define civilization as cities and writing, or as any large-scale monument-building culture, the only honest way to find them is to live in that frontier, to let the stories nudge us toward real questions, and let the rocks, bones, and sediments answer in their own slow language. In the next section, we'll push that frontier all the way to the edge, what it would actually take to prove that we are the 7th civilization, and how close or far we might be from recognizing the ones that came before. So let's take the plunge and assume the wild thing. Imagine, for the sake of argument, that those myths aren't just poetic exaggerations. Imagine there really were 6 previous rounds of complex technological monument-building human societies before ours. Not necessarily starships and laser guns, but something at least on the level of classical Rome, medieval China, maybe even the early Industrial Revolution. What would that actually mean? First, history wouldn't just need a rewrite. It would need a reboot. Right now, our timeline says cities, writing, and states appear independently in a few regions starting around 6,000 years ago, with earlier farming and social complexity going back maybe 12,000. If we found hard proof of multiple earlier high civilizations deep in the Ice Age or even before, we'd have to accept that civilization isn't a single fragile experiment that just barely worked once. It would be a repeating pattern, a phase change that humans slide into whenever conditions and knowledge cross a certain threshold, that would radically upgrade our estimate of human capability. Because then the story wouldn't be, we got lucky once in Mesopotamia and it spread from there. It would be, given enough time and relative stability, humans almost inevitably climb to large-scale complexity, over and over. But there's a darker side to that. If there really were 6 previous civilizations that reached something like our level, and we only see shadows, that means the default state of human knowledge is not steady progress. It's boom, crash, amnesia. It means that writing, engineering, mathematics, even something as basic as how to make steel, are not guaranteed additions to the human toolkit. They're precarious piles of trial and error, stored in fragile media, embedded in vulnerable institutions. When the wrong set of disasters hit, climate shift, disease, warfare, resource collapse, most of that can go. Not just the buildings, the know-how. If we're the 7th, the implication is brutal. Intelligence and culture do not protect you from being forgotten. So, if that's the hypothetical, what would it take to move it from cool idea to accepted part of the timeline? What would proof actually look like? It would not be this carving kind of looks like a rocket ship, or this rock might be a concrete block. It would be the boring, stubborn kinds of evidence that force experts to change their minds. You'd want datable industrial residues, layers where you can say, this ash, this slag, these microscopic particles only form when you smelt metal at scale, or burn coal, or synthesize some complex material. And then you date that layer securely to, say, 50,000 years ago, and you find the same pattern at multiple sites. You'd want unmistakable inscriptions, not just a few scratches that could be natural, but long sequences of symbols repeating in consistent patterns like a script. Ideally with bilinguals or internal structure you can analyze. Syntax, numbers, names. The sort of thing that lets linguists say, this is formal writing, not random doodling. You'd want standardized technology across regions. Not just people on different continents both used stone tools, but the same specific design, the same metal alloy ratio, the same measurement system, showing up in widely separated places at the same time. That's the fingerprint of a shared technical culture, maybe even long-distance trade. If 6 earlier civilizations existed, their fingerprints would have to show up like that. Not in one controversial artifact, but in patterns that hang together across geology, archaeology, and chemistry. Now, that said, there's a more modest scenario that many archaeologists are increasingly comfortable with, and it's probably the most realistic middle ground. Instead of one unified global super-civilization, Atlantis with branch offices everywhere, you get multiple, regionally high-achieving cultures rising, falling, and sometimes resetting almost completely. Think something like this. A sophisticated maritime culture around the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia when sea levels were lower. A different complex forager-builder network in what's now the Sahara when it was green. Another in the Americas, along now drowned coastal plains. Each with large ritual centers, advanced navigation, maybe proto-writing or intricate record-keeping systems. They're not flying to the moon. They're not sharing a single world government. But they are more complex, more interconnected, and more technically skilled than the standard picture of scattered Stone Age tribes. And when climate shifts, coastlines roar inward, or key rivers vanish, those cultures fragment. Survivors remember them as the people before, the golden age when the gods walked the earth. In that model, our civilization isn't the only one. It's just the first one whose data storage might actually have a shot at outrunning the next big reset. Where do we even look for traces of those earlier rounds? 3 places keep coming up. submerged continental shelves. During the last ice age, sea levels were over 100 meters lower. Huge coastal plains, places humans love to settle, are now underwater. Sonar mapping and underwater archaeology are still in their infancy compared to land digs. If there were early port cities or coastal ritual complexes, a lot of them would now be seafloor. Deserts, the Sahara, the Arabian Peninsula, parts of Central Asia all went through wet phases, with lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Those environments can flip to desert and bury sites under sand for thousands of years. Every time remote sensing peels back a bit of that cover, we find more fossil rivers, possible settlement traces, even hints of long-lost caravan routes. And jungles. Tropical forests grow fast and hide everything. But LiDAR, laser scanning from the air, has started to punch through that canopy. In just the last couple of decades, LiDAR has revealed huge interconnected city networks in places like Guatemala and Cambodia that we had no idea were that large. The same tech is now being turned on other blank green patches of the map. If proof of earlier high cultures exists, that's where the odds are best. Underwater, under sand, or under trees. So what do you do with this as someone who's going to see 1,000 breaking discovery proves Atlantis posts in your feed? A simple checklist helps. Ask, is the claim based on a single weird object, or on layers and patterns? Can the thing be securely dated, and has that dating been independently checked? Are the findings published, or at least described in enough detail that other researchers can critique them? Do the people pushing the claim ever admit uncertainty, or does everything magically confirm their theory? And most importantly, does the proposed civilization leave multiple independent fingerprints, materials, structures, residues, symbols, or just one ambiguous photo with all the context missing? If you run new claims through that filter, you won't catch everything, but you'll dodge a lot of nonsense, and you're left with a bigger nagging question. If we really are the seventh civilization, or even just the latest in a long line of forgotten high cultures, what, if anything, are we going to do differently with that knowledge? Because if 6 rounds have already come and gone, then the mystery isn't just who they were. It's why they couldn't last. And that's where we're headed in the final stretch. Not deeper into speculation, but into what this whole idea should do to our sense of wonder, our sense of humility, and the way we read the next surprising clue that comes out of the ground. So here we are, at the edge of the map. We've walked through 6 alleged earlier civilizations: Babylon's antediluvian world, Egypt's Zep Tepi, Plato's Atlantis, India's yugas and vanished cities, the Mesoamerican world ages, the Ice Age culture reset idea. And if you zoom out, they all start to look like different languages trying to describe the same ache. On one side you've got mythic memory, floods that erase whole peoples. Golden ages when knowledge was greater, lifespans were longer, the gods or those who came before walked among humans. Cycles of rise, hubris, collapse, reset. On the other side, you've got demonstrable history. Bricks you can date, bones you can measure, charcoal in a layer that you can radiocarbon, pottery styles that change slowly enough you can build a timeline out of fragments. The temptation is to pick a side. Either it's all literally true, the ancients had laser cutters, and we're being lied to, or it's all allegory. Grow up and stop taking flood stories seriously. The honest answer lives in the tension between those, because myths are not excavation reports, but they aren't random either. They compress experience. 100 generations of our people used to live somewhere else. Then the water came and everything changed, slowly curdle into a god with a thunder weapon who wipes the slate clean. And the evidence? The evidence is stubborn. It will not move just because a story is poetic or a theory is clever. Layers are where they are. Isotopes do what they do. DNA carries what it carries. So the stance that actually gets us somewhere is curiosity first, evidence always, certainty only when it's earned. That means being willing to entertain wild possibilities. Maybe there really were complex Ice Age seafaring cultures. Maybe there really were builders before the builders in more places than we've yet found, while still demanding the boring, checkable, lab-repeatable stuff before we say, okay, that's on the timeline now. It means you can respect the intuition that something big might be missing without lowering the bar for what counts as proof. This is harder than it sounds, because our brains hate uncertainty. We want a team jersey, secret seventh civilization truther, or smug debunker. But the history of science is mostly people living in the uncomfortable middle. Plate tectonics was a fringe idea until the data stacked up. Deep time itself, millions and then billions of years, was a scandal until multiple lines of evidence all pointed the same way. The same thing will be true if we ever confirm an earlier high civilization. It won't be one dramatic artifact. It'll be too many converging clues to ignore. Until then, we're in the fun, frustrating phase. We get to speculate, and we have to be patient. So here's where I'd love to hear from you. Of all the candidates we talked about, the antediluvian Mesopotamian world, Egypt's first time, Atlantis, India's yugas, the Mesoamerican ages, the Ice Age reset idea, which one strikes you as the most plausible or at least the most haunting? And why? Is there a particular story, site, or piece of evidence that sticks under your skin? A sunken structure? A text? A genetic clue? Drop your favourite maybe civilization in the comments and tell me what convinces you it might be more than just a story. And while you're there, let me know where you're listening from. One of the weird joys of doing this is realizing that people are listening to the same human origin story from apartments in Berlin, farms in India, dorms in Brazil, night shifts in Canada. Seeing that little roll call of cities and countries is its own kind of map of our current civilization. If you've made it this far and this kind of deep time detective work is your thing, it genuinely helps if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. Not just for the algorithmic gods, but because it tells me this is the kind of long-form, nuance-heavy content you actually want more of. And if you want to go even deeper into the prehistoric rabbit hole, we've put a lot of this research, and a bunch of stories that didn't fit into the video, into a book about the strangest secrets of prehistory. For all we know right now, there are ruins under 100 meters of water off some forgotten coastline. Petrochemical residues in a drill core that no one has bothered to analyze for human fingerprints. A cave somewhere with inscriptions that don't match any known script, sealed behind a landslide 10,000 years before the pyramids. Some future diver or grad student or satellite will stumble over the next clue, and when they do, we'll have a choice about how to meet it. With wonder, instead of, that can't be true because it isn't in my textbook. With humility instead of, this finally proves my favourite theory and nothing else. And with that same three-part mantra, curiosity first, evidence always, certainty only when it's earned. If we really are the seventh civilization, then we're standing in a long line of people who all thought they were the first and the last. None of them knew which of their buildings would become bedrock, which of their stories would outlive the stones. Neither do we. So maybe the best way to end is with a question you can carry with you the next time you see some headline about a mysterious discovery. If someone, 1,000,000 years from now, dug through the ruins of our world, what one trace would you hope they'd find that says, they were here, they were clever, they tried? And what if the faint fingerprints of 6 earlier civilizations are waiting right now for us to learn how to see